Josh, what is the latest on the recruiting front? Who's Nebraska going after? Any new offers out there? What's happening?
Yeah, I think right now, without an unofficial count, with so many guys, not necessarily reporting the offers, that list has got to be close to 250, maybe even 275 now as far as kids that have offered. They've, thrown out a couple here in the last week or so, and they're really kind of trying to ramp up and get ready for Big Red Weekend. I don't think it's going to be quite as big or maybe as epic as it was last year. I don't know if you're going to see, 2 or 3 commitments like they had last year. And I don't know if you're going to have quite as many big names, but I still think it's going to be a pretty good event. I think it's going to be still an event that a lot of other schools around the country kind of wish they were doing this time of year, because it's definitely an easy way to attract kids in and give them a reason to come to campus on their own time.
Josh, do you know what a tentative schedule of events or any idea what's going to happen this year at the Big Red Weekend, what those kids are going to be in for?
To be completely honest, it's very similar to a junior day. A lot of these guys will be visiting campus for the very first time. There'll be some guys who aren't the DJ Foxes of the world, the Luke Giffords, but a lot of these guys will be visiting for the first time. So it will be one of those things where, they get the whole experience. They get to tour the facilities. They get to tour the school. They maybe will sit down with an academic advisor. They'll probably have individual time or at least group time position-wise with a position coach. And then usually Sunday morning, last year they had breakfast with the whole coaching staff, including Coach Pelini. Quite a few of them then had one-on-ones with Coach Pelini afterwards, and that's where we saw some of the commitments come forward after those one-on-ones. And so it's a very similar situation to a junior day. It's just a little more selective, and so these guys know coming in that they're kind of the cream of the crop, and that if they got an invite, Nebraska's definitely interested in them. Where sometimes junior day can be watered down, because if you have one guy that Nebraska's really interested in, he might bring 2 or 3 of his teammates, where those guys, they're never going to be Huskers. They're probably not even going to be walk-ons. And so this is more of a select event, and I think kids really kind of come into the event knowing that.
Hey, Josh, I know some people are who follow recruiting closely are panicked a little bit that Nebraska only has 2 commits, and they're kind of looking at the other Big Ten schools and how they're piling up numbers. I don't know if I've heard your take on it. I'd be interested in hearing it, what you make of where Nebraska's at with those 2 commits, if people should be panicked, or if you don't see it as a big issue at this point.
I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I'm starting, I guess, to get a little, not worried, but concerned just by the fact that last year they had a few more than 2 at this point, but there was also a lot of guys that you thought were really on the cusp of jumping in. And at this point, I don't know how many guys are on the cusp of jumping in. And so I'm not quite necessarily panicked yet, but I think as the weeks go by, the concern level definitely grows. Although I really can't compare to Nebraska to places like Michigan, Ohio State, even Northwestern, because if you look at Northwestern's commitment list, yeah, they have a few guys out of state, but a lot of those guys are from the state of Illinois. And in a place like Nebraska, where they're not producing 5 or 6 BCS quality type D1 guys every year, you're just not going to necessarily have that many commitments at this time of year, because you're not going to be able to pull as many in-state guys in. And when you look at those schools who have a lot of commitments, the majority of them are coming from their own home state. They've grown up cheering for that team. They want to be, they want to be a Northwestern Wildcat. They want to be a Michigan Wolverine. And you're just not going to see that in a place like Nebraska when, traditionally maybe only 2 or 3 offers are going out to players, every year. And sometimes those players aren't even getting an offer until later in the fall.
Yeah, I guess that's the big question. Is that the way it always has to be, you think, at Nebraska, kind of the recruiting approach, where you do have to have that patience, sometimes wait guys out through their senior year, because you're offering guys nationally, and Lanny was talking about it earlier, a kid in Florida is not just going to, okay, Nebraska offer, yes, I'm committing to them. It's just not going to happen like that. So, do people just need to kind of come to a realization that's how it has to be, or could it be different where they could stack up more early commits?
I think there's a few ways it could be different. I think one, if Nebraska has a really good year in state, I think I've been here, this is my 3rd year recruiting-wise, and this is probably the best year that I've been here. If there's a year where there's 5 or 6 D1 BCS quality guys, I'm not talking D1 necessarily. I'm talking about guys that you could build a BCS team around. Yeah, I think you can get more. I think you could get more commitments. I also think if there was a rule changes down the road, I think in Nebraska you could see maybe a difference in Nebraska's recruiting. For instance, if there was not just an early signing period, but if there was the process of allowing guys to take officials earlier, whether that was 2 in the summer, or 2 during their junior year, and 3 during their senior year, because I think you guys are right. As they recruit places like Texas, California, Florida, Ohio, those guys, a lot of those times, those guys are going to have to wait to take that official visit to Nebraska unless, they're in a situation where their family can afford to, fly them into Omaha or Lincoln, and we know that's not very cheap, during this time of year. And so if there was a rule change down the road, I think it maybe level, the playing field out a little bit, and you could see Nebraska get more of these early commitments. But unless there's a rule change, or unless for some reason the Omaha and Lincoln area just start producing a lot more D1 kids, then I think Nebraska fans are going to have to be patient going forward. I just don't think you're going to have as many commitments this time of year as a lot of other schools who have more D1 talent in their state.
What's your feel on Zach Darlington? I mean, it's kind of an interest. I believe he's visiting Nebraska next weekend, correct? And then it's Ohio State the next weekend. Is that the schedule?
Yeah, that's exactly the schedule. He's coming in the 6th, so it's a week before Big Red Weekend. But that definitely bodes well for the Huskers to get him in. I think me and Brian Munson broke it down, an estimation of probably about $1,500 for him and his dad to fly in, which that's not cheap. And that shows you that he's definitely interested in the Huskers, or his dad I don't think would be dishing out the money for him to come in and check out the school. And so it definitely speaks well. I would like to see those 2 visits flipped, because I know at this point, or at least it seems at this point, that maybe Ohio State has the slight edge. And I always like, the school like in Nebraska to be more fresh in their minds after all the trips are done. So Nebraska's going to have to come out, and they're going to really have to impress this kid, because he's going to end up going to Columbus. And Nebraska, I don't want to say it'll be an afterthought, but Ohio State will be a lot fresher in his mind, and you wonder how that will play into his recruitment.
Josh Harvey is our guest on The Drive, 93.7 The Ticket and theticketfm.com. He's with Big Red Report, bigredreport.com. Josh, the question today we've been doing a couple segments on is, we asked this to our listeners on our Facebook page, if there's one thing that you could change about the way that Bo Pelini is running the Nebraska football program right now, what would it be? In recruiting or otherwise, would you have a suggestion for something that Bo Pelini could do that he hasn't been doing that could help Nebraska, make a little jump and maybe get that conference championship?
How about let the media into practices? What do you think of that, Brian?
I wouldn't complain.
I wouldn't complain. No, that's a selfish thing. To be completely honest, I don't know if there's anything that jumps out or comes to mind. I've heard people mention in the previous months and whatnot, I wish we offered more kids. I think Nebraska's offered plenty of kids on the recruiting front. I've heard people say something along the lines of, well, I wish we offered more 5-star guys. Well, at the same time, you got to make sure you got guys fitting your system, and you got to make sure you're spending time on guys that you think you legitimately have a chance at it. It's silly to offer just every 5-star kid and waste time recruiting them if you know that kid's not coming to Nebraska. And so I don't think those are necessarily things they can change. But when it comes to a team angle, I really nothing sticks out of this is one thing that if they changed, I think it would really, really help this team. At this point, there's just nothing that comes to mind.
Josh, one more thing before we let you go. Brian Bennett, one of the Big Ten bloggers for ESPN.com, recently wrote a piece where he ranked the players that had the most to prove this year in the Big Ten, and his player number 1 that he had was Taylor Martinez. And my question, I was kind of surprised by that, but my question to you is, what does Taylor have left to prove that he hasn't already done here at Nebraska?
Well, I saw that article, too, and I was really surprised. You kind of looked at some of the people that were on the list as well, and I thought Taylor stuck out. I mean, you break it down, and you think about the quarterbacks that have been through Nebraska, and for him to, be the all-time, basically statistical quarterback at this point to come through Lincoln, that bodes really well for him. And so I was kind of surprised he made that list. I think for him to really cement his legacy, and this is, kind of our feature article in our next magazine that's going to hit the newsstand soon, is I think he's got to win at least a conference title, or if not a conference title, he's got to win a BCS game. I just think that winning kind of cures all, and I don't think he's going to be remembered in that upper echelon of the Fraziers, the Taggies, the Frosts, the Crouches of the world unless he gets one of those. I really think, that's the exclamation point for him, because he's 0-2 in non-conference, or 0-2 in conference games, 0-3 in bowl games. And I think the stats are great. It's a different era of college football. I think quarterbacks have greater opportunities than they did in the 70s, the 80s, even in the early 90s. But I think one thing that fans can always compare through the ages is those wins. And because he's 0-5 in those big-time games, those big-time performances, I really think he needs to get one of those to kind of end his career on a good note. Because otherwise, in 15, 20 years, I don't know if Nebraska fans will, they'll still remember the name Taylor Martinez, but I don't know if it will necessarily be that household name down the road if he doesn't get one of those.
Josh Harvey, Big Red Report. Good stuff as always, man. Thank you so much.
No problem, guys. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Josh.
He had some good stuff in there. I was going to ask him also about his assessment of the Nebraska baseball season, but kind of ran out of time. I thought, all three of us are surprised with Taylor Martinez being number one on that list. And you know what? I understand how like an outsider might think that, because I think people still on the outside kind of look at Taylor Martinez as a guy who hasn't taken his team to a conference title, and I think that's really the only thing you can say about him, isn't it? It's I know he used to be the guy, he used to be kind of the GOAT with the throwing motion, and everyone made fun of that, and it was now it's maybe the turnovers, but when you look at it, and Josh made this point, great point. Statistically, he's probably the greatest quarterback in the history of Nebraska football. If you just look at purely statistics,
I understand where the writer's coming from, that Taylor does have something to prove, and Josh laid it out pretty well with his bowl record and his conference championship record. But it's when you look at the whole list, when you named off the other guys that were on the list.
Maxwell and a couple other guys.
He didn't fit on what the theme of that list was in some ways. So that's kind of why I had issues with it. But without a doubt, he still has something to prove, because Josh is right. Whether it's fair or not, whether your defense is good or not, at Nebraska as a quarterback, people remember you many years down the road by if you have championships on your belt. And that's the one thing that Taylor's missing. And it's not all on him, but that's just the deal with being a quarterback. That's how it is. You're kind of judged on holding up that trophy.
You either get too much credit or you take too much of the blame.
Yeah, that's just part of the gig. So, and I think Taylor knows that. So, this is it. It's been a fascinating ride. It seems like he's been here for 8 or 10
forever.
years.
Yeah.
All sorts of stuff. Go back to that night in College Station, that crazy night, and everything that's gone on. I get the sense, though, this offseason that people they're starting to warm up to him. They're starting to see him. He's doing more media interviews recently. Yep. He's been active on Twitter, communicating with fans and stuff. And I've sensed that the fan base has warmed up to him more than they have in the past, and they're seeing him in a different light, and that he's a hard worker who works with this quarterback's coach in the offseason and all this stuff. But when it comes fall, you know how it goes around here. It's what you do on the field, and he's going to have to come up big in big games for his legacy to carry on a long time.
It's The Drive on 93.7 The Ticket. I'm Lanny Holstein. He's Brian Christopherson of the Lincoln Journal-Star. We'll get to more of your suggestions for what Nebraska could do what Bo Pelini could do with the Nebraska program to improve. Up next, also a couple miscellaneous things to wrap up the show. That's next on 93.7 The Ticket and theticketfm.com.